Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 576. What a drag. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I have had a much better week this week. Not one without, some element of fraughtitude or something. But, a lot fewer hours of fraughtness. So that's a huge win. Except for this thing Tuesday morning when thing 2 had to go in for rather emergency foot surgery. I don't know if I mentioned it, but back in May, thing 2 slid down the basement stairs and decided to break a mason jar with his foot, or a ball jar. I can't remember if it was mason or ball. I didn't look at the glass that was embedded in his foot to identify which kind of jar it was. Either way, it was something that should not have been in his foot. And while the emergency room doctor who we saw did a spectacular job, took out as much glass as he could, and then said, listen, I'm pretty sure that there are some other pieces of glass, but they're very small. We hope that they will work themselves out, as foreign objects often do. It'll work its way out. It'll, create a bump, and then it'll cut through the skin, and it'll be an owie for a little while, but basically you'll see it coming, and you can deal with it then. So we kept our eyes open, and that didn't happen. And then on Monday last week, this child said to me, my foot has never stopped hurting, which is not something that a mother wants to hear. So, doctor, specialist took a look at the x-ray, said, I need to take a different angle. Came back in and showed us how on one x-ray, it looked like there was a bone that was actually part of the tarsal? The last foot bone before you get to the big toe bones, where a bunion would be if you were a grown-up person, Heather said, pointing at herself. So it looked like this bone was there and kind of a little bit floating like a kneecap or an ankle bone. Turns out there's not a bone like that at that part of your foot. And instead what that was a fracture that was fractured enough that it was kind of a free-floating chunk of bone in the child's foot. So whoops. So we went in for surgery Tuesday morning, bright and early. We won't find out until Saturday exactly what they did. We think that they removed the chunk of bone and several pieces of glass, and therefore the child is in not a cast because they can't put a cast on yet. They have to wait for the swelling to go down. Child is in a massive splint, has to stay on the back, on the butt, with the foot in the air at an angle, with ice under the knee and under the calf, because you can't put ice on the foot because there's 2 inches of gauze padding and waddling cloths wrapped around his foot. So it was interesting. We've learned that you can rent knee scooters. So that's cool. And also turns out to be really nicely useful. So all good in that respect. Yay. So that's been most of the last, it has been a full week. Last week, Thursday night, is when we went and saw the specialist. So hi, I'm so happy to be here with you and not tending to an invalid or making phone calls to insurance companies and the like, or hunting down knee scooters to rent, Instead, I get to be here with you, and that's just awesome. And a reminder for everybody, if you are interested in participating in this year's Craftlit bookmark exchange, please follow the link in the show notes. You can get them at craftlit.libsyn.com or craftlit.com for episode 576. So far, we've had 23 people already sign up in this last week. So please join the fun if you are interested. Tuesday, the 23rd. So if you are listening to this in real time, it will be next Tuesday, is the sign up deadline. Sending deadlines send by December 10th for US addresses, or December 1st if you are willing to ship internationally. And there's a little box that you can tick off if you are so willing. So today we have count them, two chapters for you, 28 and 29. The first one is called A Weird Experience, which it is. And then 29 is called The Missing Witness. Now, if you recall, at the end of chapter 27, we were left with our lawyer and narrator, Mr. Raymond, at Amy Belden's place. Raymond's description of Amy Belden's place is interesting for several reasons. He describes the books he sees there, and those are interesting. And he also describes the things he sees there, one of which is a melodeon. I didn't realize how hard it was going to be to find what I was looking for about melodeons. So I will have to wait to fill you in on that until later, until my sister can get back to me, because I needed to talk to the actual musician people. My sister and my brother-in-law, who was Van Helsing for us when we did Dracula. They're going to get back to me and let me know about the word melodeon. There are many things that get called melodeons from this time period. There are several likely versions of what a melodeon would be, what you could expect it to be at the home of someone like Amy Belden. But because there are several, I'm waiting to hear back from them, because it seems to me that the differences between the options actually kind of matter. So I will have to let you know about that more next week. One of the things I can tell you about, though, is you're going to hear a mention of daguerreotypes. And I know that we've talked about daguerreotypes ages ago on the podcast, but I didn't forget. I didn't forget. I did forget one kind of curious fact about daguerreotypes. They're pretty recognizable when you see them, you might think. And in learning more about them, I am fairly certain that there have been a number of times that I thought I was looking at a daguerreotype, when in fact I was just looking at a really, really good ambrotype or glass plate photograph, something like that. Because what a daguerreotype comes down to is it's a piece of copper that's been plated with silver and polished until it's a mirror, and then chemicals are applied and it becomes light sensitive, and then you expose it to light, and then more chemicals are applied. And then what you get is this chunk of silver colored copper with rounded edges. I am not entirely sure why that's important, but it is. And depending on which angle you are at when you are looking at the daguerreotype, and this is the kicker, either it looks like a photograph or it looks like a negative. And I am fairly confident now that there have been at least half a dozen photographs that I've looked at thinking they were daguerreotypes, when in fact I was just looking at really, really good, crisp glass plate photography. They often came in interesting boxes and kits and frames because you kind of wanted to show them off special. They weren't just a picture. But the other thing that's kind of curious about daguerreotypes is really you don't see them at all past 1860. Better processes, cheaper processes, faster processes, less exposure to mercury vapor processes came along and kind of kicked the daguerreotype out of the running. But I didn't remember that about how if you change the angle at which you are looking at the daguerreotype, it'll either look like a picture or a negative. It's just something interesting. He doesn't even say that he's looking at the daguerreotype and, oh my gosh, it looks like a negative. It's just one of those things that I tend to tell you about. So there I am, going down that rabbit hole for tonight. Yay! What other rabbit holes did I go down? Erebus. My goodness, we must have come across this word before. Erebus was the Greek primordial god of darkness, sometimes identified as the region between Earth and Hades. He's interesting because he's not anthropomorphized. So whereas Hades gets to be both a place and a person, chaos, Chronos, all these things get to be anthropomorphized. Erebus didn't, which is kind of Neil Gaiman-y to me. It sounds like something out of Sandman Act 2. And it's just a word that gets tossed around at the beginning of our chapters today, but it was one of those words that stuck out, and I thought, I knew what Erebus was or where Erebus was. I just didn't remember. And so I thought you might be in the same boat as I was. I often find myself getting irked at the word inflammable when they're talking about something that's flammable, and I realized I am really being a dope when I do that, because of course there's the word inflame and inflamed. And so inflammable would be something that is able to be inflamed. However, when I looked it up on the OED, I found out, the reason that I was getting confused is because inflammable is both an adjective and a noun, whereas flammable is only an adjective. And so my brain wasn't processing exactly where the word inflammable was landing in the part of speech, and it was getting it confused with the adjective flammable. When you hear inflammable used in the text today, it means something that can, will, or has already gone up in flames. And that's what I got for you. I am now going to turn you over to the lovely Kevin Green and his lyrical stylings of The Leavenworth Case by Anna Catherine Green, chapters 28 and 29 today for you. Here we go.
Chapter 28. A Weird Experience. Flat burglary as ever was committed. Much ado about nothing. The first thing I did was to inspect with greater care the room in which I sat. It was a pleasant apartment, as I have already said, square, sunny, and well furnished. On the floor was a crimson carpet, on the walls several pictures, at the windows cheerful curtains of white, tastefully ornamented with ferns and autumn leaves, in one corner an old melodeon, and in the centre of the room a table draped with a bright cloth, on which were various little knick-knacks, which, without being rich or expensive, were both pretty and, to a certain extent, ornamental. But it was not these things, which I had seen repeated in many other country homes, that especially attracted my attention, or drew me forward in the slow march which I now undertook around the room. It was the something underlying all these, the evidences which I found, or sought to find, not only in the general aspect of the room, but in each trivial object I encountered, of the character, disposition, and history of the woman with whom I now had to deal. It was for this reason I studied the Daguerreotypes on the mantelpiece, the books on the shelf, and the music on the rack, for this and the still further purpose of noting if any indications were to be found of there being in the house any such person as Hannah. First, then, for the little library, which I was pleased to see occupied one corner of the room. Composed of a few well-chosen books, poetical, historical, and narrative, it was of itself sufficient to account for the evidences of latent culture observable in Mrs. Belden's conversation. Taking out a well-worn copy of Byron, I opened it. There were many passages marked, and replacing the book with a mental comment upon her evident impressibility to the softer emotions, I turned towards the melodeon fronting me from the opposite wall. It was closed, but on its neatly covered top lay one or two hymn books, a basket of russet apples, and a piece of half-completed knitting work. I took up the latter, but was forced to lay it down again without a notion for what it was intended. Proceeding, I next stopped before a window opening upon the small yard that ran about the house, and separated it from the one adjoining. The scene without failed to attract me, but the window itself drew my attention, for written with a diamond point on one of the panes, I perceived a row of letters, which, as nearly as I could make out, were meant for some word or words, but which utterly failed in sense or apparent connection. Passing it by as the work of some schoolgirl, I glanced down at the work basket standing on a table at my side. It was full of various kinds of work, among which I spied a pair of stockings, which were much too small, as well as in too great a state of disrepair, to belong to Mrs. Belden, and, drawing them carefully out, I examined them for any name on them. Do not start when I say I saw the letter H plainly marked upon them. Thrusting them back, I drew a deep breath of relief, gazing as I did so out of the window, when those letters again attracted my attention. What could they mean? Idly I began to read them backwards. But try for yourself, reader, and judge of my surprise. Elate at the discovery thus made, I sat down to write my letters. I had barely finished them when Mrs. Belden came in with the announcement that supper was ready. "As for your room," said she, "I have prepared my own room for your use, thinking you would like to remain on the first floor." And throwing open a door at my side, she displayed a small but comfortable room, in which I could dimly see a bed, an immense bureau, and a shadowy looking glass in a dark old fashioned frame. "I live in very primitive fashion," she resumed, leading the way into the dining room, "but I mean to be comfortable and make others so." "I should say you amply succeeded," I rejoined, with an appreciative glance at her well spread board. She smiled, and I felt I had paved the way to her good graces in a way that would yet redound to my advantage. Shall I ever forget that supper? Its dainties, its pleasant freedom, its mysterious pervading atmosphere of unreality, and the constant sense which every bountiful dish she pressed upon me brought of the shame of eating this woman's food with such feelings of suspicion in my heart. Shall I ever forget the emotion I experienced when I first perceived she had something on her mind which she longed, yet hesitated to give utterance to? Or how she started when a cat jumped from the sloping roof of the kitchen on to the grass plot at the back of the house? Or how my heart throbbed when I heard, or thought I heard, a board creak overhead? We were in a long and narrow room, which seemed, curiously enough, to run crosswise of the house, opening on one side into the parlor, and on the other into the small bedroom, which had been allotted to my use. "You live in this house alone, without fear?" I asked, as Mrs. Belden, contrary to my desire, put another bit of cold chicken on my plate. "Have you no marauders in this town, no tramps, of whom a solitary woman like you might reasonably be afraid?" "No one will hurt me," said she, "and no one ever came here for food or shelter but got it." "I should think, then, that living as you do, upon a railroad, you would be constantly overrun with worthless beings, whose only trade is to take all they can get without giving a return." "I cannot turn them away. It is the only luxury I have, to feed the poor." "But the idle, restless ones, who neither will work nor let others work?" "Are still the poor." Mentally remarking, "Here is the woman to shield an unfortunate who has somehow become entangled in the meshes of a great crime," I drew back from the table. As I did so, the thought crossed me that in case there was any such person in the house as Hannah, she would take the opportunity of going up stairs with something for her to eat, and that she might not feel hampered by my presence, I stepped out on the veranda with my cigar. While smoking it, I looked about for Q. I felt that the least token of his presence in town would be very encouraging at this time, but it seemed I was not to be afforded even that small satisfaction. If Q was anywhere near, he was lying very low. Once again seated with Mrs. Belden, who I know came down stairs with an empty plate, for going into the kitchen for a drink I caught her in the act of setting it down on the table, I made up my mind to wait a reasonable length of time for what she had to say, and then, if she did not speak, make an endeavor on my own part to surprise her secret. But her avowal was nearer and of a different nature from what I expected, and brought its own train of consequences with it. "You are a lawyer, I believe," she began, taking down her knitting work with a forced display of industry. "Yes," I said, "that is my profession." She remained for a moment silent, creating great havoc in her work, I am sure, from the glance of surprise and vexation she afterwards threw it. Then, in a hesitating voice, remarked, "Perhaps you may be willing then to give me some advice. The truth is, I am in a very curious predicament, one from which I don't know how to escape, and yet which demands immediate action. I should like to tell you about it. May I?" "You may. I shall be only too happy to give you any advice in my power." She drew in her breath with a sort of vague relief, though her forehead did not lose its frown. "It can all be said in a few words. I have in my possession a package of papers which were entrusted to me by two ladies, with the understanding that I should neither return nor destroy them without the full cognizance and express desire of both parties, given in person or writing; that they were to remain in my hands till then, and that nothing or nobody should extort them from me." "That is easily understood," said I, for she stopped. "But now comes word from one of the ladies, the one too most interested in the matter, that for certain reasons the immediate destruction of those papers is necessary to her peace and safety." "And do you want to know what your duty is in this case?" "Yes," she tremulously replied. I rose. I could not help it, a flood of conjectures rushing in tumult over me. "It is to hold on to the papers like grim death till released from your guardianship by the combined wish of both parties." "Is that your opinion as a lawyer?" "Yes, and as a man. Once pledged in that way, you have no choice. It would be a betrayal of trust to yield to the solicitations of one party what you have undertaken to return to both. The fact that grief or loss might follow your retention of these papers does not release you from your bond. You have nothing to do with that. Besides, you are by no means sure that the representations of the so called interested party are true. You might be doing a greater wrong by destroying in this way what is manifestly considered of value to them both, than by preserving the papers intact, according to compact." "But the circumstances alter cases, and in short, it seems to me that the wishes of the one most interested ought to be regarded, especially as there is an estrangement between these ladies which may hinder the other's consent from ever being obtained." "No," said I, "two wrongs never make a right. Nor are we at liberty to do an act of justice at the expense of an injustice. The papers must be preserved, Mrs. Belden." Her head sank very despondingly. Evidently it had been her wish to please the interested party. "Law is very hard," she said, "very hard." "This is not only law, but plain duty," I remarked. "Suppose a case different. Suppose the honor and happiness of the other party depended upon the preservation of the papers. Where would your duty be then?" "But—" "A contract is a contract," said I, "and cannot be tampered with. Having accepted the trust and given your word, you are obliged to fulfill to the letter all its conditions. It would be a breach of trust for you to return or destroy the papers without the mutual consent necessary." An expression of great gloom settled slowly over her features. "I suppose you're right," said she, and became silent. Watching her, I thought to myself, if I were Mr. Gryce, or even Q, I would never leave this seat till I had probed this matter to the bottom, learned the names of the parties concerned, and where those precious papers are hidden, which she declares to be of so much importance. But being neither, I could only keep her talking upon the subject until she should let fall some word that might serve as a guide to my further enlightenment. I therefore turned with the intention of asking her some question, when my attention was attracted by the figure of a woman coming out of the back door of the neighboring house, who, for general dilapidation and uncouthness of bearing, was a perfect type of the style of tramp of whom we had been talking at the supper table. Gnawing at a crust which she threw away as she reached the street, she trudged down the path, her scanty dress, piteous in its rags and soil, flapping in the keen spring wind, and revealing ragged shoes red with the mud of the highway. "There's a customer that may interest you," said I. Mrs. Belden seemed to awake from a trance. Rising slowly, she looked out, and with a rapidly softening gaze, surveyed the forlorn creature before her. "Poor thing!" she muttered. "But I cannot do much for her to night. A good supper is all I can give her." And going to the front door, she bade her step round the house to the kitchen, where in another moment I heard the rough creature's voice rise in one long "Bless you!" that could only have been produced by the setting before her of the good things which Mrs. Belden's larder seemed teeming. But supper was not all she wanted. After a decent length of time, employed as I should judge in mastication, I heard her voice rise once more in a plea for shelter. "The barn, ma'am, or the wood house, any place where I can lie out of the wind." And she commenced a long tale of want and disease, so piteous to hear that I was not at all surprised when Mrs. Belden told me upon re entering that she had consented, notwithstanding her previous determination, to allow the woman to lie before the kitchen fire for the night. "She has such an honest eye," said she, "and charity is my only luxury." The interruption of this incident effectually broke up our conversation. Mrs. Belden went upstairs, and for some time I was left alone to ponder over what I had heard, and determine upon my future course of action. I had just reached the conclusion that she would be fully as liable to be carried away by her feelings to the destruction of the papers in her charge as to be governed by the rules of equity I had laid down to her, when I heard her stealthily descend the stairs and go out by the front door. Distrustful of her intentions, I took up my hat and hastily followed her. She was on her way down the main street, and my first thought was that she was bound for some neighbor's house, or perhaps for the hotel itself; but the settled swing into which she soon altered her restless pace satisfied me that she had some distant goal in prospect, and before long I found myself passing the hotel with its appurtenances, even the little schoolhouse, that was the last building at this end of the village, and stepping out into the country beyond. What could it mean? But still her fluttering figure hasted on, the outlines of her form, with its close shawl and neat bonnet, growing fainter and fainter in the now settled darkness of an April night, and I still followed, walking on the turf at the side of the road, lest she should hear my footsteps and look round. At last we reached a bridge. Over this I could hear her pass, and then every sound ceased. She had paused, and was evidently listening. It would not do for me to pause too, so gathering myself into as awkward a shape as possible, I sauntered by her down the road, but arrived at a certain point, stopped, and began retracing my steps with a sharp lookout for her advancing figure, till I had arrived once more at the bridge. She was not there. Convinced now that she had discovered my motive for being in her house, and, by leading me from it, had undertaken to supply Hannah with an opportunity for escape, I was about to hasten back to the charge I had so incautiously left, when a strange sound heard at my left arrested me. It came from the banks of the puny stream which ran under the bridge, and was like the creaking of an old door on worn-out hinges. Leaping the fence, I made my way as best I could down the sloping field in the direction from which the sound came. It was quite dark, and my progress was slow, so much so that I began to fear I had ventured upon a wild goose chase, when an unexpected streak of lightning shot across the sky, and by its glare I saw before me what seemed, in the momentary glimpse I had of it, an old barn. From the rush of waters near at hand, I judged it to be somewhere on the edge of the stream, and consequently hesitated to advance, when I heard the sound of heavy breathing near me, followed by a stir as of some one feeling his way over a pile of loose boards, and presently, while I stood there, a faint blue light flashed up from the interior of the barn, and I saw, through the tumbled-down door that faced me, the form of Mrs. Belden, standing, with a lighted match in her hand, gazing round on the four walls that encompassed her. Hardly daring to breathe, lest I should alarm her, I watched her while she turned and peered at the roof above her, which was so old as to be more than half open to the sky, at the flooring beneath, which was in a state of equal dilapidation, and finally at a small tin box, which she drew from under her shawl and laid on the ground at her feet. The sight of that box at once satisfied me as to the nature of her errand. She was going to hide what she dared not destroy, and, relieved upon this point, I was about to take a step forward, when the match went out in her hand. While she was engaged in lighting another, I considered that perhaps it would be better for me not to arouse her apprehensions by accosting her at this time, and thus endanger the success of my main scheme, but to wait till she was gone before I endeavoured to secure the box. Accordingly, I edged my way up to the side of the barn and waited till she should leave it, knowing that if I attempted to peer in at the door, I ran a great risk of being seen, owing to the frequent streaks of lightning which now flashed about us on every side. Minute after minute went by, with its weird alternations of heavy darkness and sudden glare, and still she did not come. At last, just as I was about to start impatiently from my hiding place, she reappeared, and began to withdraw with faltering steps towards the bridge. When I thought her quite out of hearing, I stole from my retreat and entered the barn. It was of course as dark as Erebus, but thanks to being a smoker, I was well provided with matches as she had been, and having struck one, I held it up. But the light it gave was very feeble, and as I did not know just where to look, it went out before I had obtained more than a cursory glimpse of the spot where I was. I thereupon lit another, but though I confined my attention to one place, namely the floor at my feet, it too went out before I could conjecture by means of any sign seen there where she had hidden the box. I now for the first time realized the difficulty before me. She had probably made up her mind before she left home in just what portion of this old barn she would conceal her treasure. But I had nothing to guide me. I could only waste matches. And I did waste them. A dozen had been lit and extinguished before I was so much as sure the box was not under a pile of débris that lay in one corner, and I had taken the last in my hand before I became aware that one of the broken boards of the floor was pushed a little out of its proper position. One match, and that board was to be raised, the space beneath examined, and the box, if there, lifted safely out. I concluded not to waste my resources, so kneeling down in the darkness, I groped for the board, tried it, and found it to be loose. Wrenching at it with all my strength, I tore it free and cast it aside. Then lighting my match, looked into the hole thus made. Something, I could not tell what, stone or box, met my eye, but while I reached for it, the match flew out of my hand. Deploring my carelessness, but determined at all hazards to secure what I had seen, I dived down deep into the hole, and in another moment had the object of my curiosity in my hands. It was the box. Satisfied at this result of my efforts, I turned to depart, my one wish now being to arrive home before Mrs. Belden. Was this possible? She had several minutes the start of me. I would have to pass her on the road, and in so doing might be recognized. Was the end worth the risk? I decided that it was. Regaining the highway, I started at a brisk pace. For some little distance I kept it up, neither overtaking nor meeting any one. But suddenly, at a turn in the road, I came unexpectedly upon Mrs. Belden, standing in the middle of the path, looking back. Somewhat disconcerted, I hastened swiftly by her, expecting her to make some effort to stop me. But she let me pass without a word. Indeed, I doubt now if she even saw or heard me. Astonished at this treatment, and still more surprised that she made no attempt to follow me, I looked back, when I saw what enchained her to the spot, and made her so unmindful of my presence. The barn behind us was on fire. Instantly I realized it was the work of my hands. I had dropped a half extinguished match, and it had fallen upon some inflammable substance. Aghast at the sight, I paused in my turn and stood staring. Higher and higher the red flames mounted, brighter and brighter glowed the clouds above the stream beneath, and in the fascination of watching it all, I forgot Mrs. Belden. But a short, agitated gasp in my vicinity soon recalled her presence to my mind, and drawing nearer, I heard her exclaim like a person speaking in a dream, "Well, I didn't mean to do it." Then lower, and with a certain satisfaction in her tone, "But it's all right, anyway. The thing is lost now for good, and Mary will be satisfied without any one being to blame." I did not linger to hear more. If this was the conclusion she had come to, she would not wait there long, especially as the sound of distant shouts and running feet announced that the crowd of village boys was on its way to the scene of the conflagration. The first thing I did upon my arrival at the house was to assure myself that no evil effects had followed my inconsiderate desertion of it to the mercies of the tramp she had taken in. The next to retire to my room and take a peep at the box. I found it to be a neat tin coffer fastened with a lock. Satisfied from its weight that it contained nothing heavier than the papers of which Mrs. Belden had spoken, I hid it under the bed and returned to the sitting room. I had barely taken a seat and lifted a book when Mrs. Belden came in. "Well," cried she, taking off her bonnet and revealing a face much flushed with exercise, but greatly relieved in expression, "this is a night! It lightens, and there is a fire somewhere down street, and altogether it is perfectly dreadful out. I hope you have not been lonesome," she continued, with a keen searching of my face, which I bore in the best way I could. "I had an errand to attend to, but didn't expect to stay so long." I returned some nonchalant reply, and she hastened from the room to fasten up the house. I waited, but she did not come back, fearful perhaps of betraying herself. She had retired to her own apartment, leaving me to take care of myself as best I might. I own that I was rather relieved at this. The fact is, I did not feel equal to any more excitement that night, and was glad to put off further action until the next day. As soon then as the storm was over, I myself went to bed, and, after several ineffectual efforts, succeeded in getting asleep. Chapter 28. Chapter 29. The Missing Witness. I fled and cried out death. Milton. "Mr. Raymond." The voice was low and searching. It reached me in my dreams, waked me, and caused me to look up. Morning had begun to break, and by its light I saw, standing in the open door leading into the dining room, the forlorn figure of the tramp who had been admitted into the house the night before. Angry and perplexed, I was about to bid her begone, when, to my great surprise, she pulled out a red handkerchief from her pocket, and I recognized Q. "Read that," said he, hastily advancing and putting a slip of paper into my hand, and without another word or look left the room, closing the door behind him. Rising in considerable agitation, I took it to the window, and by the rapidly increasing light succeeded in making out the rudely scrawled lines as follows: "She is here. I have seen her, in the room marked with a cross in the accompanying plan. Wait till 8 o'clock, then go up. I will contrive some means of getting Mrs. B. out of the house." Sketched below this was the following plan of the upper floor. Hannah, then, was in the small back room over the dining room, and I had not been deceived in thinking I had heard steps overhead the evening before. Greatly relieved, and yet at the same time much moved at the near prospect of being brought face to face with one who we had every reason to believe was acquainted with the dreadful secret involved in the Leavenworth murder, I lay down once more and endeavored to catch another hour's rest. But I soon gave up the effort in despair, and contented myself with listening to the sounds of awakening life which now began to make themselves heard in the house and neighborhood. As Q had closed the door after him, I could only faintly hear Mrs. Belden when she came downstairs, but the short, surprised exclamation which she uttered upon reaching the kitchen and finding the tramp gone and the back door wide open, came plainly enough to my ears, and for a moment I was not sure but that Q had made a mistake in thus leaving so unceremoniously. But he had not studied Mrs. Belden's character in vain. As she came, in the course of her preparations for breakfast, into the room adjoining mine, I could hear her murmur to herself, "Poor thing! She has lived so long in the fields and at the roadside, she finds it unnatural to be cooped up in the house all night." The trial of that breakfast! The effort to eat and appear unconcerned, to chat and make no mistake! May I never be called upon to go through such another! But at last it was over, and I was left free to await in my own room the time for the dreaded, though much to be desired, interview. Slowly the minutes passed. 8 o'clock struck, when, just as the last vibration ceased, there came a loud knock at the back door, and a little boy burst into the kitchen, crying at the top of his voice, "Papa's got a fit! Oh, Mrs. Belden, Papa's got a fit! Do come!" Rising, as was natural, I hastened towards the kitchen, meeting Mrs. Belden's anxious face in the doorway. "A poor wood chopper down the street has fallen in a fit," she said. "Will you please watch over the house while I see what I can do for him? I won't be absent any longer than I can help." And almost without waiting for my reply, she caught up a shawl, threw it over her head, and followed the urchin, who was in a state of great excitement, out into the street. Instantly the silence of death seemed to fill the house, and a dread, the greatest I had ever experienced, settled upon me. To leave the kitchen, go up those stairs, and confront that girl seemed for the moment beyond my power; but, once on the stair, I found myself relieved from the especial dread which had overwhelmed me, and possessed instead of a sort of combative curiosity that led me to throw open the door which I saw at the top, with a certain fierceness new to my nature and not altogether suitable perhaps to the occasion. I found myself in a large bedroom, evidently the one occupied by Mrs. Belden the night before. Barely stopping to note certain evidences of her having passed a restless night, I passed on to the door leading into the room marked with the cross in the plan drawn for me by Q. It was a rough affair, made of pine boards, rudely painted. Pausing before it, I listened. All was still. Raising the latch, I endeavoured to enter. The door was locked. Pausing again, I bent my ear to the keyhole. Not a sound came from within. The grave itself could not have been stiller. Awe-struck and irresolute, I looked about me and questioned what I had best do. Suddenly I remembered that, in the plan Q had given me, I had seen intimation of another door leading into this same room from the one on the opposite side of the hall. Going hastily round to it, I tried it with my hand, but it was as fast as the other. Convinced at last that nothing was left me but force, I spoke for the first time, and calling the girl by name, commanded her to open the door. Receiving no response, I said aloud, with an accent of severity, "Hannah Chester, you are discovered. If you do not open the door, we shall be obliged to break it down. Save us the trouble, then, and open immediately." Still no reply. Going back a step, I threw my whole weight against the door. It creaked ominously, but still resisted. Stopping only long enough to be sure no movement had taken place within, I pressed against it once more, this time with all my strength, when it flew from its hinges, and I fell forward into a room so stifling, chill, and dark that I paused for a moment to collect my scattered senses before venturing to look around me. It was well I did so. In another moment the pallor and fixity of the pretty Irish face staring upon me from amidst the tumbled clothes of a bed, drawn up against the wall at my side, struck me with so death-like a chill that, had it not been for that one instant of preparation, I should have been seriously dismayed. As it was, I could not prevent a feeling of sickly apprehension from seizing me, as I turned towards the silent figure, stretched so near, and observed with what marble-like repose it lay beneath the patchwork quilt drawn across it, asking myself if sleep could be indeed so like death in its appearance. For that it was a sleeping woman I beheld, I did not seriously doubt. There were too many evidences of careless life in the room for any other inference. The clothes, left just as she had stepped from them in a circle on the floor, the liberal plate of food placed in waiting for her on the chair by the door, food amongst which I recognized, even in this casual glance, the same dish which we had had for breakfast. All and everything in the room spoke of robust life and reckless belief in the morrow. And yet so white was the brow turned up to the bare beams of the unfinished wall above her, so glassy the look of the half-opened eyes, so motionless the arm lying half under, half over the edge of the coverlid, that it was impossible not to shrink from contact with a creature so sunk in unconsciousness. But contact seemed to be necessary. Any cry which I could raise at that moment would be ineffectual enough to pierce those dull ears. Nerving myself, therefore, I stooped and lifted the hand which lay with its telltale scar mockingly uppermost, intending to speak, call, do something, anything, to arouse her. But at the first touch of her hand on mine, an unspeakable horror thrilled me. It was not only icy cold, but stiff. Dropping it in my agitation, I started back and again surveyed the face. Great God! When did life ever look like that? What sleep ever wore such pallid hues, such accusing fixedness? Bending once more, I listened at the lips. Not a breath, nor a stir. Shocked to the core of my being, I made one final effort. Tearing down the clothes, I laid my hand upon her heart. It was pulseless as stone.
Okay, so that was a lot. I know it was a lot. And I wanted to give you more chapters, but I'm going to give you more chapters next week. So, okay, first off, Amy Belden has Byron. And Raymond just treats that like, oh, she has poetry and taste. She has Byron. I mean, this is why I was saying the Melodian could be several different things, because she's more interesting a person than I would have expected her to be, because she's got Byron. At the same time, while she's got Byron in her bookshelf, she also says one of my favorite lines in this entire book: charity is my only luxury. I mean, charity is my only luxury. That is so not our world for the most part, but so, oh, if that was our world. Wow. Blew my mind. That was one of those times when I rewind and just listen to it again and go, yep, that's a keeper. Just struck me as so unique and so out of my world of daily reference. I loved it. Love, big heart, loved it. So Amy Belden gets aces in my book. And then Poor Thing does get used as part of the larger ploy, first by Q. And hello, Q is in drag as the woman who is homeless who comes to the door at the night before. And I don't know about you, that was a mic drop for me. I was surprised by that one. But of course, that was nothing compared to finding out that Hannah's dead. That was tricky. That was hard. Here we felt like, oh, great. We are going to finally find out what Hannah knows. And no, we're not. Oops. So now there's a new mystery that we have to find out the answer to. But we're not going to do that this week. That'll be there for you next week, because there is going to be an episode that comes out the day after Thanksgiving. You're welcome. I'm going to record it after the Zoom call tonight. You take care of yourself. Be safe, wear a mask, get a vaccine, get a booster if you can, if you need to. Do all the things you can do to protect each other. I know you already do, and I love you for it. Thank you for being awesome. I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.